Hi everybody, I'm Alister Benn and you're watching Expressive Photography. One of the hardest things in landscape photography, I think, is that concept of not being able to see the forest for the trees. Looking out at a big landscape and not really being sure where the shot is or the best way to find the shot. So in this week's video, I want to take you back to the Gobi Desert, where, as many of you know, I was there 7 times over a number of years, which is a really difficult landscape to shoot for various reasons. And I want to talk you through the process on how I was able to rationalize the big landscape and break it down into what I consider to be some of my favorite photographs. Before we get started, I just want to thank everybody who watched last week's video and bought a copy of Out of Darkness, my new photo book. The response has been amazing. It's just really humbling, the support that I'm getting for it. If you want to check out, there's a link at the bottom of the video here in the description where you can go and check out the 3 different editions of the book: the standard, the deluxe version that comes with a print, and the super duper collector's edition, which comes with 5 prints and some musical compositions that I'm making specifically for the project as well. So please check the link below because you're really supporting our work by buying a copy of the book. So when it comes to landscape photography, I think there's a really good reason why people flock to pointy mountains at sunset, or to the coast where there's beautiful sea stacks at sunset or sunrise. We get drawn to things that are dynamic and pointy in particular because they're energizing. One of the things that really struck me when I went to the Gobi Desert was that a lot of it seems quite flat. And obviously the period of time at the beginning and the end of the day is quite brief compared to the amount of hours that you spend out there in the middle of the day or like mid-morning, mid-afternoon. And what we found was that we were able to shoot for much, much longer periods of the day when we were able to sort of understand what it was in the landscape that was really speaking to us. I think when you go into any landscape where there's a horizon that's not pointy or dynamic in any way, or if there's a landscape that isn't particularly dynamic in its own right, we tend to think of flowing water as very dynamic. We think of pointy mountains as very dynamic. If you go into a landscape that has a flat horizon, it can be very difficult to get energized because the overall scene is just expansive. And, you know, this is where sort of long exposure minimalism comes from, is making meaningful photographs in somewhat not dynamic landscapes. But what I found was that by looking at the bigger picture and even taking a few frames of the bigger scene, I was able to isolate and see in those frames other things that were dynamic, that were exciting. And I think what I'm trying to advocate in today's video is that we somehow subconsciously know that there is something there, but it may not be obvious in the bigger picture. So the concept I want to talk about today is that of isolation, and I guess the sort of concept of small scenes, but framing it in a very different way. It's very easy to talk about abstracts and small scenes, but the whole concept of them is meaningless unless we actually understand why we're pointing our cameras at them in the first place. Let's jump into my Lightroom catalog and look at some of these examples and find shots within shots, and then we can start to understand this a little bit better. This shot was actually taken on the very, very first day that I went into the Gobi. So this was back in January 2017. And it wasn't long after we'd left the road and kind of got into the desert itself. And I was just in awe of all of this beautiful, pristine sand. But where I was at that stage was I was a kind of traditional landscape photographer. I was a foreground, midground, background kind of guy. And this shot was taken at sort of mid-afternoon, so that the directionality of the light wasn't incredibly prominent. But what I was beginning to understand was that having relationships within frames, like, you know, this section down in the bottom left-hand corner there, leading up to these dunes, there is a flow to it, but I don't necessarily think it's that interesting a photograph. It's obviously taken with the blue sky and stuff like that. But what I did do in processing was I processed it in a kind of a quirky way. This is actually using a luminosity mask as a pixel layer. So this is just one of the zones in the photograph, and it's been turned into a photograph. And I think what I've managed to do here is just highlight some of this beautiful texture and added contrast that wasn't necessarily there in the scene just by using luminosity masks. Now that's kind of an advanced technique, but there are shots within shots. Here's another really good example. Now this shot is taken late in the day, so we can see there's a strong amount of directionality here in the light. There's some deep, deep shadows. And the thing about this shot is that the blue sky is obviously hugely dominant. So we either have a couple of choices. We can crop the dickens out of it and take it right down to, some kind of very extended panoramic format. And what that does is it reduces the stuff that isn't the love sauce of the image, the exciting stuff in the image. Every photograph, I think, that is meaningful has something in it that just really gets us excited. And in this scene, it's actually this area here. Now, I could take a crop out of this photograph and take it absolutely down to the wire, and we would end up with something perhaps like that. Now, obviously, you can't zoom in to that extent without only having 10 pixels left, regardless of how many pixels you start off with. So I think in this particular case, it would be a way to look at this scene as how can we really get the most out of what is there. And contrast is obviously a really important thing. The whole idea of contrast giving impact, and by creating more contrast, we're actually allowing the bits that are exciting and dynamic to really stand out in this frame. This one may work quite beautifully in black and white, because what it does is it allows us to push the contrast even more. Once we're in color, you start pushing that contrast and the blues start looking weird, the colors can look a wee bit weird. Actually, it's not too bad. But in black and white, you can really push that envelope almost until the sky is completely white. And that increases the luminosity of this foreground element, which shines out of the darkness. The whole concept of my book, Out of Darkness, was that concept that for me, there is always light somewhere. Even in your darkest hour, you know that there is some light, there's some hope, there's something that keeps you going. And for me, this is what it was in the desert, was just the beautiful simplicity of the light in the darkness. So I think, we've come quite a long way from this somewhat bland raw file to quite a beautiful contrasty black and white there. So I think it's understanding what is the star of the show, what is the important thing in the frame. And we don't need pointy mountains all the time, because this area in here is little miniature pointy mountains. Here's another really good example. Now this again, it wasn't super directional light, but there was some shadow. This is a vertical 3x2, so full frame in my Nikon D850. And I think what we need to do is understand that there are things in this frame that are reducing the eloquence of the photograph. There are clearly some very strong elements, like this area where the bush is just getting caught by the shadow there, this curve, this point, and this beautiful rounded dune at the top there. The inclusion of the slope and the sky isn't adding to this, it's actually taking away from it. So the easiest thing for us to do is to grab our crop tool, take it down to a 4x5. And something I tend to do subconsciously is, you can see the gap here at the top of this dune. Kind of subconsciously, I've created a space at the bottom that's equal to that space. And what that does is it's allowing the top curve and the bottom curve to feel very, very balanced. If one of them is much more than the other. So the bottom there has a lot more space than the top. The top is going to start feeling compressed. And that distance between the top of the dune and the frame there, it's almost like a tension point. It's like someone talking to you too close and their face is right in front of yours. We are more comfortable when we have a little bit of space around us. And I think it's just worth checking there to see how much space we have. And it may well be that we can afford a little more space at the top than the bottom there. And I think what that's done is it's allowed the image to sit in the frame much more comfortably. It doesn't feel like there's any tension in this photograph at all now. Everything just feels very harmonious. These are raw files, so you'll notice that there are a few sensor spots showing their presence. I can't start processing a file when there are sensor spots in it. It's just one of those things that really gets me. Now you will see here that there are no deep blacks in this photograph at all, and there are actually no whites. Now what I do believe is that we can process images in a way that make them very powerful, very strong. Contrast, in my lexicon anyway, contrast is somewhat synonymous with impact. A powerfully, you want to make a bold, powerful statement. Think of contrast as a volume control. So I'm actually going to do a ridiculous adjustment here. I'm going -5 stops on the black slider, and I'm going to increase the whites until they start to clip. So that's the maximum amount of contrast I can get into this frame. And I'll dial it back a touch because -5 was a bit too much. And one of the things you'll notice right away is how hideous the colors are. These warm tones just get absolutely murdered by that level of contrast. But we can bring down the saturation and introduce a color palette that is okay. It might take a little bit of fine tuning to find that perfect little white balance there. But on the whole, you will see that as we increase the contrast, the image actually simplifies so that the shadows shape much more and the highlights stand out much more. This is another photograph that I think I'm just going to make black and white there. Get rid of the color. The color becomes such a dominant part of this scene. And then we can actually afford to go a fraction darker again and just make a really deep and moody black and white image. When I'm processing these things live, when I'm recording a video, I'm not thinking about what I want to do. They just become a reflection really of how I feel. And maybe today I'm just feeling a little bit subdued, a little bit in the shadows. So I'm enjoying making these kind of dark and moody photographs. The landscape itself is made up of the 5 elements that I've spoken about before: luminosity, contrast, geometry, atmosphere, and color. So this photograph here is made up of very strong geometry. There's that beautiful dune in the foreground, strong diagonal, and then this very atmospheric receding background here. And I think with any photograph, and I'm just going to process this while I talk to you, it's very easy, I think, for us to overthink photography, because in this scene there is a photograph, and I don't believe we need to do a terrible amount to it for it to just be itself. And using the temperature slider to create, so I'm going to look at the background there. So I want to make the back so it feels slightly blue, and then I'm just going to bring up a gradient from the bottom and just warm the foreground a bit and increase the luminosity of the foreground. And what that's instantly done there is created depth. The foreground now feels closer, more immediate, it's warmer, so it's more uplifting. The back is cooler, further away, more receding. Very simple adjustments. And what we're doing is we're allowing the geometry and the subtlety of this scene just to be a little bit more articulated. Processing, I don't believe, has to be overly complicated. It's more about feel and understanding where the shot is in the bigger picture. This is a really good example for me. This is the genesis of a photograph that means a huge amount to me, and it actually became the cover of the Out of Darkness book. I'd climbed up to the top of this dune on my own very early one morning for the sunrise. I'd never been to this location. I had no idea what I was going to find. It was just climb a dune, see what there is. And as the sun started to come over the horizon, I was very, very aware of these beautiful, delicate, and they felt cooler to my mind than perhaps they really were. So I'm just going to look at that bit of this scene, because there was exquisite beauty hidden in these shadows and the way the glow started to come over the horizon. But what I realized was that when I was photographing the big picture, I was losing the nuance of those folds in the landscape. I didn't feel I was making a good photograph by photographing the big picture. So what I did do was I just zoomed in, got rid of the sky completely, and this is the photograph I made, where the folds of the blanket, the folds of the shadows were the photograph, and using the flare of the sun just in the top right-hand corner there. And as I said, this image just meant so much to me. It became the cover of Out of Darkness. So I think this is a really classic example of understanding there are beautiful landscapes hidden in big landscapes. A really good way to start is to photograph the big landscape and then look on your viewfinder. Find the bits that just really capture your imagination, that grab your attention. That is where the photographs are going to be. If you just go to a landscape and plonk down your tripod in front of a rock, in front of a waterfall, in front of a big mountain, all you're ever going to come away with are foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds in a very predictable way. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're loving doing what you're doing, then don't let me tell you to stop doing that. If they're the types of photographs you love to make, then that is great. But we all know that those types of photographs rely on golden light, side light, beautiful clouds, atmospheric conditions, fog, all of these different things that are Milky Ways if you want to go and photograph them at night. Those things require very, very specific atmospheric circumstances and times of the day. What you will find if you go out in flat light is the landscape is still full of really exciting things to point your camera at. And what you will do is you'll end up having a day that you go down the rabbit hole and photograph something you would never have imagined to photograph just because you were open rather than being closed. If you talk about the choice of would you rather be open or closed, most people would say they would like to be open. So I think in closing, I think it's just worth saying that the landscape is a big place. The landscape is filled with possibilities. Our imagination can be closed to these opportunities. Everyone talks about needing great light to photograph. I don't necessarily believe that's true. I think to make impactful, striking photographs, then having some sunlight in them is great. My great friend Adam Gibbs talks about the light all the time. For Adam, it's all about the light. When the sunlight hits the landscape, it really lifts his spirit, and he loves photographing that. When Adam and I were in the Gobi, it wasn't always like that. There were days when we weren't getting that type of light, and Adam photographed things that spoke to him in other ways. This photograph was taken at noon in completely flat light, and it's the form of the landscape that is telling the story. It's not about the light. It's not about the directionality of the light. There is no directionality of light here. It was a completely cloudy sky, but there was beautiful forms in the landscape. So I think in closing, all I really want to do on the Expressive Photography channel is open opportunities rather than closing doors. The more open we are to different things, the more happiness we're going to find in the landscape, the less disappointment we're going to find when we go out with expectations that don't become realities, and when perhaps the weather doesn't do what it's supposed to do to make our perfect photographs. I know fine well, living on the west of Scotland, that if I went out every time expecting perfect conditions, they would rarely materialise, and my best photographs of this region are always made just by being open to what is there and what is happening, even if it's stormy and almost impossible to stand up. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody who's bought the Out of Darkness book, and I would really hope that more of you will decide to invest in your own copy. This is pretty much my life's work and has become the springboard that I'm using to teach expressive photography, to help people address their own mental health and to try and just make life a little bit easier for everybody. By supporting our work, you're supporting everything that we do and the more people that we can actually try and help through our work. Thanks for watching. It's been an emotional week. It's been quite a struggle for the last couple of weeks with various things that have been going on. But once again, I would just like to thank everyone who supports our work, watches the channel, subscribes and comments on our videos. It means the world to me, so I just wanted to extend my thanks once again. Check the link below for Out of Darkness. The pre-sale is available now with free shipping to various countries around the world, including North America, the UK and much of Europe. So if you want your copy, we'll ship it to you for free. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Bye for now.